Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today we will be talking about something that I think is highly problematic, if I'm allowed to use that word in the current year, since that's been co-opted by so many people, I'm told, with respect to men of all ages, but increasingly young men, and the human relationships they build, specifically the friendships, the male friendships that they build. Because let's be honest, in the hyper reality of the current year, a lot of guys are over focused on their obsession with women, their relationships, and they end up neglecting other elements in their lives. I've talked about this before, it's not the first time, but this will probably be one of the first discussions of greater length on the topic. So, I want to start off with what I might refer to as canonical example, and I'm not going to be insulting the guy. I'm going to be purely descriptive here. We all remember Monday, who is now departed from YouTube for reasons that are inscrutable to most of us. And he strikes me as a good and interesting example of somebody who's older than your typical guy these days, obviously, but very much reflective of this phenomenon in the way he spoke, the way he talked about friendship in general. As many of you know, Monday was on a quest to find a one or the one, some sort of long-term relationship, and that seems to be all he ever cared about. And he would frequently refer to friends as a means to find a girlfriend. So he would talk about the way you get a girlfriend or a partner is uh, by having friends. So he never really, at least projected the feeling of the sense that he esteemed friendship, particularly male friendship, very much. And again, not judging at all, one did get the sense that he was not particularly rich in that department, which is to say he didn't really have many friends, I would guess, because at least based on what he showed to us from his video content or discussions, it does seem that he was heavily and almost exclusively focused on finding a female partner. And I wouldn't call this one-itis at all, but rather some-itis. It's my own term here, because some-itis manifests when all other social avenues are practically non-existent, and then you, as a consequence, hyper focus, over focus on this one element, and it becomes your everything in the process. And with some itis, and I've observed this with other men as well, it's not as if it's one amongst many you found the one. It's you found some girl, and then the some girl becomes the one because there's basically nothing else on the table. And again, not to insult the guy, I have nothing against Monday, and he's gone anyway. But he seemed to be a good example of this phenomenon that I'm about to describe and discuss at length with my friend. Because I think there are lessons to be learned and definite pitfalls for younger men in particular. So, with that said, I'll turn the podium over to my friend. You've observed this, I guess. You're coming from a different perspective, as you are fortunate not to be interested in women. In
Yes, I am everyone's limp wristed associate. Yes.
yeah, okay. But I think that this is not something people really talk about these days very much. Interpersonal relationships, friendships, because they're all so hyper focused on, for lack of a better word, superficial things. Um, the obsessive pursuit of females, and I'm not sure whether or not it's a new phenomenon or something that's been around for quite some time. Because I've met people like that, and Monday was my age, but curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I feel like I also agree with the idea that we've romanticized finding relationships way too much to the point to where it seems that people expect so much out of their partner when it comes to life when you can't really expect that because they're also human. And then also again, there is a lack of mentors, mates, and mentees where you can pass on your knowledge onto the next generation, right? Or get your knowledge from the previous generation, or even experience knowledge within your generation, right? With your mates, with your comrades,
Hmm.
um, with everyone that you're trying to figure out life with, right? And this is something that because there's such a lack of community, it seems that people don't know how to build a community from the ground up. Not necessarily a community out of interest, but a community out of experience.
I
Uh,
can't I can't
me,
help but just briefly. I
mhm.
wonder if this has to do, at least in part, with generational disconnects. You talk about mentors and mentees. I mean, arguably,
I
your average normie guy in his 40s or 50s, some your normie guy, doesn't understand the plight, if you will, the situation that a lot of younger men find themselves in because, frankly, they're completely disconnected. If they already have married, if they're already gone down the traditional route of whatever expectations in life, then they're in a situation where they simply can't relate. And I've encountered this having talked to younger guys that say, well, when I talk to people your age typically or older, all I hear are platitudes. All I hear are these things that you're supposed to do, but don't necessarily have the same application as they did at the time. And even I experienced this back in the day because I would hear references to the way things were in the 1960s in the 2000s, and even, wasn't always applicable. So I'm curious what you think about that. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh yeah, no, that's totally okay. Well, I mean, I think it's like a document, right? Like these are guidelines to follow, and sometimes guidelines need to be updated, right? And that's the idea behind having a mentor. You have some kind of guideline, not hard rules to follow, but a guideline. And from your mentors, you talk to the people of your generation, right? And you iterate what they have given you before. You cross things out, try new things, you take those risks, but you take those risks with your peers, and that is what provides that shared experience with your peers. That it builds that camaraderie, right? But there seems to be such a lack of wanting to do that in the first place, that momentum to do that, or even the intentionality to build something deep and personal with your friends.
But the problem here is the updating, right? A lot of the older guys I've noticed, based on reports, some interaction, mostly on reports from younger people, aren't updating. I think this is just a general human phenomenon. People find some paradigm or model that works for them, and they typically run with it as long as it works. Because if something works, you don't need to update it. Now, if you spent, I mean, this is seemingly a poor analogy, but if you spent all your time on some island fishing in a certain way, and then the ocean dries up of fish, and you need to look for alternatives, it suddenly becomes a challenge. But if that never happens, it's perfectly fine because these sorts of adaptations and the sort of rethinking of things, new analyses, they only come about if the situation itself changes. Otherwise, if you have a working model or paradigm, there's no motivation. I think that's probably what's driving a lot of this. I don't think it's a lot of people say, oh, boomers, or just older people in general, as a meme, since everyone over 30 apparently is a boomer, and I get it as a joke, but I just think that most of it's down to people having working models that work for them and not being able to think out of the box. And on top of that, you could say that's a general problem with human beings and problem solving, that as soon as a person finds a model that works for them, they become A, overly confident in that model, and B, overly, well, they tend to overgeneralize it to other people. I mean, you can see this with all sorts, whether it's weight loss or maybe drug problems, alcohol problems. Well, I did this, so you should just do this. And sometimes that just doesn't work for everybody, or there needs to be some other approach. So I think in terms of the updating factor, that's really what's at the heart of it. And it'll be hard to motivate your average sort of normie type of guy to want to update their model on how these things work, not least of which because yeah, there's just no reason. Of course, you get the PUA types and whatever these, I don't want to call them charlatans, these huckster types, more or less the same thing, I guess, who will quote unquote update their models because they have to keep abreast of what's going on. But I think part of the disconnect there is just, yeah, things just work for some people and they're just not applicable anymore. So why would you bother? Um, I mean, my own example of my father during the Great Recession, I remember being told how you need to pound the pavement and this and that, and these were things that apply to the early '60s or the mid '60s maybe. It didn't work so much at the time when I was, I guess one of the victims of the Great Recession. So because frankly speaking, my father was not willing to update his model, and that's just the way a lot of older people are. They find something that works and they just run with it. That's, of course, not very useful if you're trying to understand the modern male psyche in the situation, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, and I think it's like important for young men in their late teens, early 20s to really understand that you need mates to update your model because you have to be intentional about things. You can't do things alone. And that's why your 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 mates are so important because they give you the information that you can't get, right? Like a very easy analogy that I love to give is that I'm colorblind, right? I need information from other people to tell me if, let's say, chicken is cooked correctly because I can't see it, right? Of course, you can look at the texture of the meat and such and so forth, but just missing one sense makes you rely on your brothers, and they should be close, right? Because we're dealing with big picture life, and I think that's something that a lot of people miss is the big picture behind life, intentionality. Why do the things that you need to do? Why have friends in the first place? Outside of, oh, we are social beings, right? What kind of quality friend do you want? How do you get from point A to point B? If you have low quality friends, how do you get to higher quality friends? And this was something that Monday was kind of on track for, but this was in the context of finding a partner, right? Um, but I do think that he was kind of missing the thing before that. If you want to find a high quality partner, you need to have high quality comrades around you. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, and I think that part of the issue, of course, is this applies to so-called romantic relationships as well, obviously, although I think to a lesser degree. But oftentimes with friends, it's something you just sort of fall into. This is most typified by childhood friends, right? You just people you grow up with, you hang out with. There isn't necessarily a seeking out factor there or a factor of analysis. It's just people you grew up with, and that that's normal. But I think as you get older, is what happens. I think, especially as you move away, a lot of these childhood friends disappear. Um, I don't live in the country of my birth and have not in many, many eons. So you just don't really get to, you're not in contact with these people. And you realize that a lot of friendship is based on circumstance, the sort of conventional stuff, rather than some kind of connection that is intentional and built up over time. And you could argue that circumstance can be connection too, but The minute you remove those circumstances, and I'm somebody who's lived in a lot of different places, you notice how the friendship dissipates rather quickly because there's nothing really underlying it or undergirding it. So, yeah.
Right, right. It's very similar to if you have a class with someone in university and you're just friends with them, once that class ends, you stop being friends. So, and that's not really and that's not really friendship in the first place.
Hmm.
So, but you want things to kind of transcend that. And in terms of that, for young men, it's them having to they have to learn how to articulate that themselves to themselves, articulate what kind of friendships they want, and then how to go about that. And then it's a bunch of trial and error, right? Building that pack of close friendships. And I'm not saying it has to be a group, but all those small but significant friendships that will lead to a more fulfilling life, because your friends should be giving you a piece of life that you wouldn't have been able to experience by yourself. But in order for that to happen, you have to be very intentional about your friendships. You have to be very explicit with people, and it requires you to be articulate, which most people don't exercise. That is what I find. Because if you say your regular thoughts to a normie, they're not going to take it that well, right? Because I personally do think that there are things that you can learn from people who are normies and people who are normal, right? In the sense that um, they're gonna have something that they specialize in. There's gonna be something that you can learn from everyone, right? Um,
You can learn something from anyone potentially.
yeah, and why limit your own life because of that? But in order to build to gain that knowledge, you do have to build that interpersonal relationship with someone. And if you're just doing activities with someone, that's not enough. You have to be intentional about things. Even take a moment to say, "Oh, hey, I know we do this all the time, but I want to get to know you a little bit more. Let's just chat for a bit, right?"
Mm.
Um,
What I think that sort of analysis, that sort of perception, is not theirs in the typical, for lack of a better term, heterosexual male friendship. It's just we like playing Counter-Strike locally or globally offensive, and that's just fun and whatever, and it is fun perhaps, or we like playing this game, and that's nice, but it's just there's no depth beyond that. Perhaps because there doesn't seem to be a need for that, or there's not really perceived to be a need there. Uh, but I think you're definitely onto something that there need to be layers. It's all well and good that you might enjoy playing a game with somebody or shooting hoops with somebody, and you can maintain that ritual even if you're not necessarily close to a person. But if you want to go the full mile, you need to start looking not elsewhere, not necessarily in the sense of to other people, but elsewhere in the sense of the person concerned.
right, and I think young men need to start being intentional about life. And a big thing about life is your relationships with other men. How, like, even the question of what is a high quality friendship? How do you go about that? How do you build that, right? A lot of people in my generation, as a Zoomer, don't really understand that. Most people don't even understand the difference between an acquaintance and a friend, right?
Here's my
The line's
autism.
very blurred.
Yeah, in whatever language I speak, people just don't use the word acquaintance anymore. It's a pet peeve I have, and I don't want to get all linguisticy because that between us that's fine. The audience would be bored, but I see these terms being used interchangeably, and I think the youngest Zoomers, your generation, they don't delineate this at all. I still use the term, but I'm an old fogey. And I think when terms coalesce, when you lose an item, a lexical item such as acquaintance, then you're losing some subtlety there. So there you get the context of it. Sometimes people refer to people as friends, but they actually mean acquaintances. But the lines definitely have been blurred. And I think my sense, of course, is that the internet and the connectivity that we I'd argue suffer from as much as benefit from accelerates that to varying degrees.
Yeah, and it just I think this is just from the lack of focus in building personal friendships with people. Because if you truly have a personal friendship with someone, that changes your whole perspective on friendships because you know exactly what a deep friendship looks like versus a friendship where, oh my god,
Just
versus a friendship where there is no depth to it, where you're only doing activities with someone, right? Because you should be able to talk to your friends about your worries, your vulnerabilities, right? And they should be able to prop you up. But what I find as every straight guy's limp wristed associate, that I end up being their personal therapist, which I don't mind. But it's very strange to me that heterosexual men, are not having these conversations with each other where you should be able to relate to your friends that way, but this is it's important to be articulate because they can't articulate this with each other. It is what it seems like to me. And that's important because you've now identified a lack of something in your life or something that you can build. And of course I'm generalizing, but I think this is a skill that has been lost in the past with previous generations because they gave guidelines to things and things were iterated again. You had an idea of how to build a quality friendship, but now with how everyone is separated from reality sometimes, like there is a level of separation from it. People have forgotten what depth feels like,
well,
or people
generational gaps, as I pointed out, these patterns reiterated themselves because there wasn't much change. I mean, to sort of steelman well, it's not really the other side, but steelman the position of the youngest guys or the younger guys. Again, so much of what used to apply doesn't really apply anymore, and it's it's difficult. I've spent some considerable time sort of investigating this phenomenon because I have both an interest and a concern. How does it, because I'm not a young guy, but how does one as a young guy navigate the world? How does one, get something like quality friendship or meet people that actually matter, that are going to reciprocate, that sort of thing? And it is, I mean, it's something that you spend your entire life working on, to be fair. There's no perfect formula
Mhm.
for this, but it, the past oftentimes was at least relatively connected and reflective of the future. Now it's just so different. And people, I think, to add to your point, whether males or females, I mean, females in their own way, are very much buffeted about by the winds of connectivity, by social media. They're It's difficult to think in terms of intentionality and directedness and that sort of thing in this kind of atmosphere. It's very confusing. There's endless distraction. A lot of distraction uh, is is senseless, and some of it's even malicious in the sense of these gurus or hucksters that are a dime a dozen who are trying to misdirect people. Now, it's not just in terms of human relationships. I mean, frequently these hucksters are people trying to sell you some way of getting a girlfriend or a wife. Sometimes they're selling you some sort of diet or exercise plan, but it's arguably, for all the safety, for all the connectivity, for all these things, the world has been probably never been quite this difficult to navigate, just in level, the general sense of confusion that people have. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think for that, it's just kind of a matter of asking yourself, what is the type of friendship that I want? And then the first thing is finding someone who shares that sentiment of wanting to have a high quality friendship and talking to them about it. Like it's a very strange conversation, but I think it's a very important conversation to have of what kind of friends do I want to make in the future? And I think that this conversation should be happening around the age of 16, 17, 18, right? Right before um, you're off on your own in the world, right? Because I think university, for most people of my generation, Zoomers, is an important thing because that unlocks so much for you in terms of building at least interesting friendships, depending on where you go. Because time, place, location, so important, so important, right? Like you said before, when it comes to friends of circumstance, you want to rise, uh, right? You want to make your friendships transcend that circumstance and to be everlasting, right? But it's important,
Ideally, uh,
yeah, ideally.
but you
Yeah.
also want to be able to identify the fair weather friends, for lack of a better term, and the acquaintances that you meet along the way that you met in History 101 or whatever, or the guy, you'd have lunch afterwards with, but you know that there isn't much going on there beyond the circumstance itself. And that is something I think it's very difficult to discern. It took me years after living in multiple different countries to discern sort of the fair weather circumstantial friend slash acquaintance from things of duration. And even then, um, it, it it took even longer because people have their shadow sides, or their shadow elements, and you just don't really know what lurks in the heart of men, so to speak. So I think it's always an ongoing process, but certainly when you're much younger, you don't question these things because your sense of time is different, you know? I mean, I'm not sort of attributing this sort of immortality fallacy to young people, but when you're older, you have a much greater sense of your mortality. Time is slipping away, you know. All things being equal, I'll die before you, probably. And so it's it's one of these phenomena that you just don't really think about because the circumstances of your life and your life in theory just keeps on going. So you're not really being precise about how you're interacting with people because you don't have a sense of the limits of your life as well when you're young, when you're 19, 17, 18, even your early 20s, even throughout your 20s. There's a sense of immortality, of course, but there's also that sense that you're just not, there's no real limitation, that the circumstance and the party never ends. And I think that's a huge factor because it's going to limit you in how in your discernment of people and whether or not something is worthwhile or useful in terms of the time you invest in. You see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, I totally get what you mean. And that's why like I really do push for people to learn this early,
Hmm.
um, right before they become adults. Because from there, you're going to iterate on what your idea of what a quality friendship is so many times. And you're going to iterate again and again and again until you understand what works for you. And that's the thing, is finding what works for you. Because by the time you hit your 20s, you should have an idea of, or at least like around 21, you should have an idea of oh, these are the type of friends that I like. These are the type of friendships that I enjoy. I know exactly how to build this with someone from the ground up, right? And there just seems to there is a lack of that. And intentionality about life should intentionality about life should really start early on so that you can get through all the messiness in the beginning. Because there's so much messiness. Like being able to filter through those fair weather friends, like you said before, being able to filter through your own mistakes, right? Because you are going to make those mistakes.
Yeah, and this is
There's,
where the danger emerges, especially with the huckster types. I mean, there's a lot of focus on intentionality and sort of getting things done in order to, build a career or do this. Not much talk
mhm,
about these arguably more sensitive, but equally, if not more important factors in life, like interpersonal human relationships, particularly friendships between men. There's a lot of talk about relationships, obviously, but it's very technical, and who knows how accurate it is. I don't think they're necessarily these people have good intentions. But yeah, we just don't really have these discussions about what it takes to build lasting friendships, and I can't really claim to be an expert myself. It's failed repeatedly, sometimes for reasons that are just inscrutable to me to this day.
mhm.
But
And
you know,
sometimes it's like it's not even the fault of yourself either. That's the thing. That's why I really highlight person, place, and time because with a lot of people, when they're in a certain circumstance, it's really easy for them to be kind people. But when you put them in a bad circumstance, that's when you see who they really are. Um,
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I
and you have to be really careful with friendships of expedience and but it's very easy to filter through those because you just put them through one situation that is number one important to you, number two not easy to get through for them, and if they at least try to meet you halfway or even on your meet you on your side on your terms at least once, then you know you have a keeper. It's a bunch of giving and taking, and it's really important to filter out those takers, those take, because those will ruin your life.
sure. And then people, and I've experienced similar things where people's behaviors have changed in the flip of a dime. One day everything was fine, and the next day just boom. And it happens. As you pointed out, there's a lot of messiness involved. And but for the young guys, I have the sense that they're not even, they're not even on track to explore the messiness. Because to explore the messiness, you need to go through the first steps. And I mean, I think you're fairly unique in a number of ways. Not just because you don't like women, but also this this perspective at your age is relatively rare, and it's difficult to transfer it to your average young guy. Now, you mentioned earlier how uh, some of the straight guys come to you to, I guess, share, for lack of a better word. Can maybe you could describe that or go into that a bit?
Oh, oh yeah, so it just usually just ends up being because I'm more sensitive than your average person. I just these guys just end up gravitating towards me.
Hmm.
And I don't mind. I think that it's important to have these conversations, and if I am a way for them to have those conversations, why not? All right. And it's funny that they can share this a with their Olympus associate in which they've only known him for like a few days, but with their long term friends, they can't do that, and I think it's kind of sad. I think I encourage them to share things with their friends to build those friendships with their friends so that I'm not needed anymore. Right? I don't like being the only crutch.
Do you
I
feel
should
as if you're sort of an expedient tool just because you're gay?
sometimes yes, because sometimes I just end up being uh that tool like you say. Um, but sometimes people need that in order to recognize something else within themselves, right? It's similar to linguistics when you're taught about the anatomy of the mouth and you suddenly become aware of things, how
Hmm.
things are in your mouth, right?
Hmm.
So this is just a matter of me providing that kind of practice for the men around my age or the younger men or the younger
Well,
um,
to play devil's
fellows.
advocate, or not even devil's advocate, I suppose a standard feminist answer might be, well, these guys have fallen under the evil purview of the patriarchy, and so they've lost their feminine touch or side because uh, they've bought into patriarchal stereotypes or something like that. But in general, it's that's always been the case that straight guys fail at sharing at the emotional level because I think there are a number of factors going into this. One factor is just this idea of problem solving. It's a very male thing. So you don't typically don't talk things over. Talking things over, even without a concrete solution, could help. Sometimes, sort of getting things out of your system, if it's bottled up at least, can be helpful. But generally speaking, the standard masculine answer is there a problem? Okay, how do we attack it? A, B, C, only C works. Okay, we do C. But if none of the above work, what's the point? And I think that's not. I wouldn't even call that a flaw. That's just sort of the way typically men work, particularly at least straight men. And in that context, you might have a situation where, yeah, the guy has a problem, your friend has a problem. If you can offer a solution, you'll help, but merely talking over it, merely sort of just hashing it out, if there's no direct solution, I've noticed, and many guys at least, produces a sense of awkwardness. And I don't think it's because they sort of they then suddenly feel as if they're women or something equivalent, but just the it's just, is there a solution or is there not? And I think with not accusing you, of course, of being a woman, but with women, it's the opposite really. It's to talk everything endlessly. Solutions are oftentimes irrelevant. It's more about just the the talking it through and getting it out of your system, which of course is useful, but ultimately, without a solution, it it's also just empty words. So there's some sort of happy medium I'm proposing, maybe.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily empty words, right? I mean, the reason why you have friends is so that you can hold the burdens of life on everyone's shoulder,
Hmm.
right? You're going through life together. You're not going through life alone, right? That's why I do say that you should be talking about these things that you're experiencing in life with your friends
Hmm.
so that they can help you carry your burden so that your burden isn't as much of a burden anymore, but rather it's something that you guys are going through together. And I do think that even if there's no solution right now, the reason why it's healthy to be able to just talk about it is so that it's at least what you say is out there. It can be thought of. It's a seed, right? You might not have all the materials you need to grow it properly, but at least you have something where you can put it away for now and then just grow it later, right? Just save that seed for later once you have acquired everything that you need.
Yeah. Well,
Because
absolutely.
sometimes, oh, sorry,
No, no, go on,
go.
go on. I interrupted. Go on.
Because a lot of the times through life, that what I found is that I have problems or like a lot of problems, but I do not currently have the tools to resolve it. But it is good to be aware of that problem and to talk to people who might have some of the tools that you need uh, for the future. And you just keep this bottled up inside just because it has no solution. It doesn't help anyone because maybe you have one tool, your friend has another, and then your other friend has the last tool that'll help everything. But you guys only have bits and pieces,
Yeah,
which is yeah,
yeah, and I also think, as I mentioned, that if you want to look at, I'm not a big fan of the yin and yang paradigm. Um, Solutions are great, but sometimes it just helps just to, as you put it, maybe discuss it and then table it for a time being, just to get it out of your system. Sometimes, I mean, at the end of the day, humans are social creatures, and I think it's very highly indicative the fact that straight guys will, open up to you and sort of unburden their social ailments upon you, or socialism. I mean, you see this too historically, as in not historically, sort of, but sort of I've observed this in my own life, where a lot of guys clearly, I think mistakenly with women, but feel okay, well, I'll just open up to this woman because it's a here's the strange paradox, right? A lot of straight guys feel okay in opening up to women, but they miss out on the fact that the women, being on opposite ends, women are always judging you because that's just the way the mating dating game works, right? So whether you actually want a relationship or not, they're looking at it from a perspective of judgment, right? And ideally, even though there's competition, there's intrasexual competition between men, the men are gonna probably judge you theoretically at least a lot less because they're not looking at you in that sort of all or nothing game sense that women are. And so it's a mistake, I think, to open up to women. I think maybe that's part of the reason why a gay guy in your case for these guys is such a good bet because maybe they sense that they can't open up to females because then they're going to lose some of their prestige points. And for all the reasons discussed, they can't really open up to their quote unquote guy friends, their straight guy friends. So you're sort of in this middle ground position.
yeah. And being in this middle ground position, I still end up having the conclusion that you should be talking about this with your other straight guy friends also. Um, but it's good to have that. It's good to have that perspective of, or that perspective from people who are experiencing life as you are also,
Mm.
um, whether generationally or even in terms of attractiveness, right? Or the people that you were attracted to. That's why um, gay men will have a group of friends that they call their straight friends, and then a group of friends that they call their gay friends, right? Two separate groups don't necessarily come together very often, but each group provides a different perspective, and you do play a different role in both groups. Um, and I think it's kind of important for young men to recognize that they are playing the role of being a friend, and when you are when you by carrying that role, what kind of responsibilities do you have to other people? And if you don't fulfill those responsibilities, then these are things that you need to work on, right? Because when you do end up, you want to be as well prepared as possible so that when you do meet a good person, they recognize that you are also a good person and they will hold on to you because there are so many awful people in the world that when you do find someone that is of high caliber, you hold on to it. You don't let it go.
Yes, it reminds me of the famous quip of Polonius and Laertes in Hamlet as he sees his son off. He says, "Those friends you have, their adoption tried, grapple unto them with hoops of steel." Yeah, grapple onto their soul with hoops of steel. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the Polonius principle, I would call it. But even then, it can be very, very difficult to discern. And my sense is that there's such a hyper focus on acquiring relationships, especially with the within the manosphere, even though there are different branches of it. Of course, in Normieville too, that all this other stuff, this other very important stuff, gets lost by the wayside. And then you have older guys, frankly speaking. This kind of reminds me of the Monday situation a bit, although again, I nothing against the guy. These guys who you could say made poor choices with respect to their wives. I mean, maybe, but the wives intentionally tried to filter out the few friends that he did have and isolate them. This is a very common feature I've seen, phenomenon. I've talked to a lot of guys about this, been through it, where frankly, um, they go through a marriage and they've lost all their friends because the wife made it exquisitely difficult for him to maintain those few friends he had. And a lot of them were high quality, maybe some of them were circumstantial. And then, of course, through the isolation, the guy becomes lonely and sometimes divorce ensues or some other issue. So I think this has always been an issue, really. Heterosexual men, when they're not in control of, yeah, their hearts, their minds, and frankly speaking, their peepees, they can really lose track of this other important stuff. And at the end of the day, uh, most relationships, especially most particularly romantic relationships, are pretty fleeting. Especially romantic relationships between men and women. I mean, it's all predicated on, yes, we've been talking about criteria too, but I do find, at least on average, whatever that means, typically, friendships are much more humanizing. I think that in a sense, you're much more willing to accept certain flaws between friends than you are in partners in general. That's especially true, I think, when you have this laundry list, as people typically do, right? Of this needs to be right, this needs to be that, this is right, rather than this is cool, this is kind of but whatever, we can work through it, something like that. People are much more forgiving of the flaws of people within the context of a friendship. And this is one of the reasons why I think ultimately, pardon me, very early here, from a MGTOW perspective, friendship is more durable because the relationship is always teetering, the romantic relationship or the whatever male female relationship is always teetering on this push and pull effect of the criteria that you set forth that the person needs to meet. Now, arguably, and again, MGTOW perspective, I think it's mostly women who are setting forth this criteria, and it's up to the quote unquote man to meet them. But that's part of the problem. The minute you fall short of that, there's a problem, and it can blow up and expand to the point where the relationship doesn't work at all anymore. A lot of that has to do with modernity, circumstances, and the fact that women don't generally view men as human beings, but rather as accumulation of traits that they're looking um, to find embodied in a person. But I think again, friendship has a much more humanizing element to it that's very much lacking in romantic relationships. And when you fully give yourself to quote unquote romantic relationships and neglect these friendships, you end up, I think, often isolating yourself all the more because the relationship dissipates because you've revealed some weakness or whatever, and she's lost interest, and or she's divorced you in the case of marriage, and you're left with nothing basically. I think that that's an all too common thing that happens to older guys who have been married, but also younger guys who really haven't taken the time to reflect upon this. Uh, as you know, someone who's quite young, you have in fact. But I think there's a lot, and this is an important thing because typically in relationships, especially women and apparently gay guys too, are very exacting and demanding of all these attributes and criteria that being in a more middle ground position where flaws and what have you are not as relevant to the deselection process um, allows you a lot more room to work with and actually I think potential to build something of great meaning and significance over time in the form of friendship.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I really do think that you should focus on your friendships too, just because when you're in the emergency room and you're asking yourself, who can I put down as a reference, and you
Hmm.
don't have anyone, that's it's one of those moments where it really hits you that you should have built those interpersonal relationships with your friends on a personal level, because who can you rely on the minute you're in the emergency room alone?
Yeah, I mean, classically it would be your wife and family, but A, when you're young, that's not really an option, and B, these days, I mean, that's not really a reliable factor either. The whole wife and family bit. Very few men are going to end up in that position, and the few that do are probably going to end up getting screwed in the process. So, yeah, of course, there's family, but that's I think that's also the beauty. I mean, this is a bit of a platitude, I suppose. But the beautiful thing about friends is you can pick and choose. You can't sadly choose who your parents are. You can't choose who your family members are. You're just kind of stuck with that, and you have to deal with it in one way or another. But you can make choices about the people you choose to associate with. And in that sense, it's, for lack of a better term, a much more tailor-made experience. And it can be, and that's really essential. I think that's what we're really getting at, that's the sort of experience you want to kindle in yourself and others and engender throughout your life if possible.
Yeah, and if you think about it, um, the quality of information that you're going to be receiving through life will be through your friends, and that's why it's so important to be able to have those high quality friends and you yourself be high quality, so that when you do share information with each other, you can trust that. You can trust them.
Yeah,
Whether it be about science or it would be about how to resolve a conflict with another friend.
you know,
And
I am curious about something because you're young,
ask away.
right? You you don't encounter this perspective or this mentality very much in people your age, as in one doesn't. I'm curious, you probably don't encounter it very frequently in your peers. So how do you go about that when you're interacting with people, since most people just they have a very standard approach to these things. They haven't thought it through.
Well, for me personally, I usually try to avoid group situations. I utilize group situations to find people that I like and then hang on to the small sample that I really like. And it's with that small sample where I will just hang out with them one on one, at most a small group of the three of us,
Mhm.
and over a meal, because I think sharing a meal with someone is so intimate, and sharing a meal with someone is a very difficult situation in that you're eating with someone, there's going to be some silence, but how do you negate that silence but have content with to fill it up with? And it has to be meaningful content, right? And it's a set amount of time because you're not going to be eating forever also. Um, because for me, it's important to have those one-on-one conversations, to share a meal with someone. And during that meal, I'll just ask them like, "Oh, how's life going?" Or even straight up. So I had this idea. The idea is um, friendships versus acquaintances. Do you separate them? How do you separate them? And I personally just go straight into it. And I think most people know that I'm weird by default, even though I try to be normally presenting. But
Normie presenting.
um,
I like that term.
yeah, and despite that, I think people can recognize that you're trying to have a high level conversation with them, even if they can't have that conversation with you in that point in time. I think it's important to give people a chance to try and to give them a chance to grow, right? With people my age, it's just the matter of I think they're smart, I think they're capable, and I've seen a lot of them grow. But sometimes they're just not conscious of it in the beginning, and that's something that you have to account for, right?
Yep.
I'm going to invest my time to someone, but I'm going to make sure that they're capable of processing it. So I will give them small theoretical situations such as that to think through, and maybe or not maybe, but I will revisit in the future when they've had the chance to think about it to process it, right? Because you can't. It's like changing someone. You can't expect them to change instantly. You kind of have to let it you have to leave them alone for like a little bit and see if they try, right? And that's like one filter where if the person doesn't try, then they're not really worth giving your time, right? And that's one filter that I've learned is give them a theoretical situation. Are they going to try to understand it? Um, and even theoretical situations often uh, leads you to test, oh, is this a person empathetic also? Um, because me personally, like I will talk about, let's say, incels to people, right? And I will give them the perspective that I have about incels, and I will see if they will just laugh and take it as a joke, or if they will be a little bit more serious about it. Because I personally do give off that a little bit of a serious vibe when I talk about um, my my want for incels to like succeed, right?
All right.
And whatever they want out of life. And seeing how they react, if they're the type of person that will just laugh, not take it seriously, I know that's a filter of, okay, goodbye, that's done, right? But if you have the type of person that is truly interested in growth, that truly interested in the human experience, and you outline the whole incel situation as, or the way I outline it is, do you think everyone deserves love? And if these people are seeking love, is that a bad thing, right? And then you see what kind of empathy comes out of that person, and how they handle that situation from that point forward. Uh,
Interesting. I would of course approach it from a more sociological point of view, but I get that. Yeah, I think that the incel topic in general it tends to provoke very extreme reactions, and especially
mhm.
in quote unquote normies, easily dismissible. So it's interesting that you choose such a, I guess, hot topic, to break break the ice,
Yeah,
because most people don't even spend time thinking about this stuff.
yeah. I mean, like it's very apparent to see if how a person reacts to you, right? Because I'm a very polarizing person, And I would rather use my personality or the things I personally think about as a filter for friendships, right?
Mhm.
What you think about as an individual or whatever your concerns are about life, you should use that as a filter for friends so that you have friends who are on the same path as you in life or have some kind of general idea or sentiment that they share with you. You don't want to have friends that you're disconnected from. Um,
Yeah,
your end goals should be similar.
I think as well, given how, pardon me, politically polarized our times are, and people have organized into these political tribes very much so. Yeah, my preference, I have to say, is for people who are not. I mean, obviously, people are going to have their political tendencies, but people who aren't so overwhelmed by their own politics that the politics themselves become a filter for conversations of greater depth. And I think that that can be a huge obstacle in the current year with politics being what they are. Because personally, I would say I wouldn't want to be limited in any topic. I don't want to be, tone policed or something like that. So that would already exclude, the vast majority of left-wing politics. Um, and then there are aspects to sort of the right wing that would probably limit certain conversations as well. So I'm not saying, look for unpolitical people, but at least people that aren't overwhelmed by their own politics such that they're not capable of really getting into certain topics. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, which is why like I love the incel situation so much because I frame it in a way that is
Well, they don't, but okay.
I love it a lot just because I personally frame it in a way where it's a more human experience, right? That search for love, that need for love, that want for love. That is something that you cannot argue against, right? And if you do try to argue against it, you're just arguing against this caricature of what incels are. That's the thing that usually happens. And the people that I find, even if they're political, they can be good people. What I find is that they become more empathetic to the whole incel situation because they see it in a different way. And this is why like I think it's so important to be articulate yourself because you need to be able to frame your own ideas in a way that is totally radical to most people. Like
Hmm.
you need that originality. You need to provide that novelty to people because in the beginning you're going to be entertainment, right?
Hmm.
As an individual, you want to be an experience. You don't want to be a caricature of some kind of model.
Right.
And for me personally, being an experience is what has given me so many good people in my life. And um, and working on like I started working on this at the age of 17, becoming an experience. That is something that I have not regret at all. And like even with MG right? Some of my good friends have all come to it in a different way. Like I came into it through interest in incels. My other friend came into it through the PUA industry. Another just came through it naturally as how naturally through the quote unquote red pill on YouTube, right?
Hmm.
But we all ended up in the same situation in that we were all interested in this topic, we came about it in different ways, and it's like interesting to talk about that type of thing. But
If I may ask, are they also gay or not
no,
really?
they're also straight.
Okay. See, that's the thing. I mean, it's always that question: Can can gay men be MGTOW? Well, I guess why not?
I
Uh,
think no. I don't think so.
well, I mean, in the sense, if you just as a gay guy decide that, screw it, relationships just aren't worth it, you can just do your own thing. It's not as if
Mhm.
I mean, there's some aspects obviously that are easier in Gayville, but some that aren't. I could definitely see that. But so you approach it from a kind of sociological interest, but these friends of yours, I guess, are more uh, hmm, more along the lines of they're actually sort of walking the MGTOW path, so to speak.
Uh, yeah, kind of. It's like a dip in looking at it perspective, but I don't think they consider themselves MGTO either, because I don't either, which is like
Hmm.
why this community is so interesting to me because it's a different set of ideas, right?
Hmm.
And because of the way that my friends and I have built up our friendship, and is in a way where we're all trying to find the truth of life, right? And this is my own model that we base things off of. We're very open to discussing different types of communities or different ways of living, and that's been a very fulfilling thing for me. But that took a long time to get to that point. Like we all started when we were 17.
All right.
Um, so, and I'm not saying that, and that's why I do want young men to think of this very early on because it'll produce a more fruitful life. It will get you places if you think about this early and you try a lot of things early
Mm.
because then you have the rest of your life to enjoy it. Because most people, um, your midlife is at 40,
Well, the thing is,
and
and I mean, to your point, it talks about sort of like models and paradigms that simply work, and then people just run with them. I think that everyone does that. They find some pattern that works, and they just run with it. Um, they don't engage in the experimentation. They don't get out of their comfort zone. And I'm not saying you should always get out of your comfort zone. There's a lot to be said for comfort, but um, sometimes that's forced upon you. But if it's never forced upon you, then you run the risk of going throughout your entire life without really uh, taking opportunities, sort of the opportunities that you're talking about, I think.
yeah, because what I've learned about life is it's very vast. The type of people that you meet are very interesting. It's just a matter of if you want to meet interesting people, you yourself also have to be interesting because interesting people don't hang out with boring people.
Sure.
And if you want to put yourself into that situation, you really have to be intentional about yourself. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Intent. Yeah. So lessons to be learned. Be intentional. Uh, be seeking. Be inquisitive. But again, it's just so hard in the current year environment. And I think a lot of these traits are just sort of, at the end of the day, a lot of people just don't have them. I mean, I think a lot of these traits are just endemic to certain individuals more so than others.
hmm
But I think as a general rule, just keeping an open mind is probably just probably if one kernel of wisdom from all of this, yeah, just keep an open mind about things. I mean, I have conversations, I wouldn't call it, with all sorts of people, friends or not. A lot of them aren't friends. People that I really don't agree with much. I'll talk to religious Catholics, and they believe things that personally I think are just absurd, but I'm interested in what motivates them to think that way. Um, I engage in conversations with progressives to try to understand their mode of thinking. I've talked to a lot of people on the right to understand their mode of thinking. And what you get at the end of the day is a sort of collage of of different human attributes, some of which are more distributed in one direction versus the other. But it certainly helped me understand, just in terms of inquisitiveness, understand the world a lot more. It's one of the reasons why I I just don't sort of isms are. I'm not really a fan of isms, leftism, rightism. Well, those aren't really common isms, but this sort of thing. because I do want that opportunity to just hear what people have to say, whether I agree with them or not. Typically, I end up really not being in agreement with anyone because I don't really fit any particular paradigm. That's my eternal curse. But I do think that being intentional, learning patterns in human beings and what to sort of filter out and not, these are all important things. And at some point in time, you just take that sort of, I guess, leap of faith of trust on some level. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. That's the other thing. This isn't a perfect model. Um, and so, one does what one can. Well, it's extremely early here, so I'm going to thank the audience for joining us. Hopefully, it was an interesting discussion. I'd like to think that not many people have these sorts of discussions on YouTube, so whether you enjoyed it or not, it is a rarity. So I will check you guys out later. And thank my friend for joining me. Thank you
Thanks for
for
having
joining
me.
me. Brought to you by the power of ridiculous time zone differences. So I'll check you out later, and everyone take care.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.